The dust settled around Katherine Lambert's boots as she knelt beside the scrawny mongrel lying in the shadow of the general store. And that single act of mercy would change everything about her carefully ordered life in Twin Falls, Idaho. The year was 1883, and the summer heat bore down on the main street with relentless fury. But Katherine paid no mind to the sweat dampening her collar as she carefully examined the dog's matted fur and hollow ribs. "Miss Lambert, you ought not to touch that creature, Mrs. Henderson called from across the street, her voice sharp with disapproval. "It probably has fleas, maybe worse." Katherine did not look up. Her hands moved gently over the dog's body, checking for injuries while speaking in low, soothing tones. "He is just hungry and scared. Nothing that a little kindness cannot fix." From the hitching post outside the saloon, Dalton Crawford watched the scene unfold with growing interest. He had ridden into Twin Falls an hour earlier, his horse tired from the long journey from Boise, intending only to water his mount and grab a hot meal before continuing on to his brother's ranch. But something about the young woman tending to the stray dog made him pause, made him want to stay and see what she would do next. Dalton was 26 years old, weathered by years of working cattle drives and helping his brother establish their ranching operation. He had seen plenty of folks in his travels, both kind and cruel. But there was something different about the way this woman moved, the genuine care in her touch as she examined the injured animal. Katherine finally stood, cradling the dog in her arms despite its smell and the dirt that would surely stain her blue calico dress. The animal whimpered softly but did not struggle, as if it understood that help had finally arrived. She turned toward the small boarding house where she rented a room, her dark blonde hair coming loose from its pins in the heat. "That is a good way to get bit," Dalton said, stepping away from the hitching post. His voice was low and even not judgmental like Mrs. Henderson's had been, merely observant. Katherine stopped and looked at him properly for the first time. He was tall, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of creek water, green-brown and steady. Dust covered his worn jeans and chambray shirt, and his hat was pulled low against the glare. He looked like every other cowboy who passed through Twin Falls, and yet something in his expression was different, gentler somehow. "He will not bite me," Katherine said with quiet confidence. "He knows I mean to help him. You sound mighty sure about that." "I am sure. Animals know when someone cares." She shifted the dog's weight in her arms. "Now if you will excuse me, I need to get him some water and food." Dalton found himself following her, leading his horse by the reins. "The boarding house allows dogs, Mrs. Patterson will make an exception once I explain the situation." Katherine's voice carried a determination that suggested she would make sure Mrs. Patterson understood one way or another. "And if she does not, then I will find somewhere else to stay." Katherine said this simply, as if it were the most natural choice in the world, to give up her own comfort for a stray animal. Dalton tied his horse to the rail outside the boarding house and climbed the steps behind her. He was not entirely sure why he felt compelled to see this through, but something pulled him forward, made him want to witness more of this woman's unexpected kindness. Mrs. Patterson answered Katherine's knock with a smile that quickly faded when she saw the dog. "Oh, Katherine, no. You cannot possibly think to bring that animal inside my establishment. He is injured and starving, Mrs. Patterson. I only need to keep him until he is well enough to find a proper home." Katherine's green eyes pleaded more effectively than her words. "Please, I will keep him in my room." "You will not even know he is here." "That is highly unlikely." Mrs. Patterson crossed her arms, but Dalton could see her resolve beginning to waver. "What will the other boarders say?" "They will say that you are a charitable woman with a good heart," Katherine replied, "and they will be right." Mrs. Patterson sighed heavily. 3 days, Katherine. You have 3 days to nurse that creature back to health and find him a home. After that, he has to go. Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. You will not regret this. Katherine slipped past the older woman and headed up the narrow staircase, still cradling the dog carefully. Dalton touched the brim of his hat to Mrs. Patterson, who gave him a sharp look. "And who might you be? I hope you are not thinking of following Miss Lambert up to her room." "This is a respectable house." "No, madam. I was just wanting to make sure the dog got settled all right." Dalton felt heat rise in his face that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. "I am Dalton Crawford. My brother has a ranch about 15 miles north of here. The Crawford place, Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly. "I know of it. Your brother married Sarah Montrose last spring, did he not?" "Yes, madam, that is correct." "Well, Mr. Crawford, Miss Lambert is a respectable young woman, a school teacher in fact, and I will not have her reputation compromised by strange men following her about." "I understand, madam. I meant no disrespect." Dalton tipped his hat again and retreated down the steps, feeling foolish. What had he been thinking? Trailing after a woman he did not even know. Yet even as he untied his horse and led the animal toward the livery stable, he found his thoughts returning to Katherine Lambert and the gentle way she had handled that injured dog. Twin Falls was not a large town. The main street consisted of a general store, a saloon, the boarding house, a small church, a blacksmith shop, the livery stable, and a handful of other businesses. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a simple wooden structure that also served as a meeting place for town gatherings. Beyond the town, the landscape stretched out in rolling hills covered with sagebrush and bunch grass, broken occasionally by stands of cottonwood trees along the creek that gave the town its name. Dalton had spent little time in Twin Falls before, as his brother's ranch was closer to Boise for most supplies, but he had promised to check on a horse that might be suitable for his sister-in-law. The livery stable owner, a grizzled man named Pete Thompson, greeted him with a nod. "Heard you were asking about that roan mare," Pete said, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "She is out in the corral. Good temperament, not too spirited but not lazy either." Dalton examined the mare carefully, checking her legs and teeth, running his hands along her flanks to feel for any signs of injury or weakness. The horse was indeed a fine animal, well suited for Sarah's needs. They negotiated a fair price, and Dalton arranged to pick up the mare in the morning after his horse had rested. "You planning to stay in town overnight?" Pete asked, counting out the money Dalton had given him as deposit. "Seems like I might as well. My horse could use the rest, and I would not mind a hot meal and a real bed. The boarding house is your best bet. Mrs. Patterson runs a clean establishment and her cook makes a fine stew." Pete grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "Of course, the saloon has rooms too, if you are wanting something with more entertainment." Dalton thought of Katherine Lambert and that injured dog. "The boarding house will suit me fine." When he returned to Mrs. Patterson's establishment, the landlady greeted him with a knowing look. "So you have decided to stay the night after all, Mr. Crawford. If you have a room available, yes, madam. I have one room left, as it happens." She quoted him a reasonable rate. "Supper is served at 6 o'clock sharp. We do not hold meals for late arrivals." Dalton checked his pocket watch. It was just past 4. "I will be here." His room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out over the backyard. He could hear the faint sound of a dog whimpering somewhere in the building, followed by Katherine's soft voice speaking words he could not quite make out. The sound made him smile despite himself. After washing the trail dust from his face and hands, Dalton made his way downstairs just before 6. The dining room held a long table where the boarders took their meals together. Mrs. Patterson introduced him to the others as they assembled. Mr. Garrett, the banker, a portly man with mutton-chop whiskers. Miss Simmons and her elderly mother, who were visiting from Portland. And finally, Katherine Lambert, who entered the room just as everyone was sitting down. She had changed her dress and fixed her hair, though a few strands still escaped to curl around her face. Her hands, Dalton noticed, bore several fresh scratches, likely from bathing the dog. She met his eyes briefly and offered a small smile before taking her seat across from him. "How is your patient?" Dalton asked as Mrs. Patterson's cook brought out bowls of beef stew and a basket of fresh bread. "Resting comfortably." He drank nearly a full bowl of water and ate some scraps of meat and bread. "I believe he will recover with proper care." Katherine's voice carried a note of relief. "You have taken in another stray?" Miss Simmons asked, her tone suggesting this was not the first time Katherine had done such a thing. "I could not leave him suffering in the street," Katherine replied simply. "You have too soft a heart, my dear," old Mrs. Simmons said, but her voice was kind. "Though I suppose there are worse faults to have." The conversation moved on to other topics. The upcoming church social, the state of the crops in the valley, concerns about a group of horse thieves that had been operating in the region. Dalton found himself listening more than talking, content to observe Katherine as she interacted with the others. She spoke with intelligence and care, choosing her words thoughtfully. When Mr. Garrett made a dismissive comment about the need for continued education funding, Katherine politely but firmly defended the importance of the schoolhouse, citing specific examples of students who had benefited from their studies. "You are the school teacher here?" Dalton asked, though Mrs. Patterson had already mentioned it. "Yes, I have been teaching in Twin Falls for 2 years now." Katherine broke a piece of bread, her movements precise and economical. "Before that, I taught in a small school near Portland." "What brought you to Idaho?" Katherine's expression shifted slightly, a shadow passing behind her eyes. "I needed a change. When I saw the advertisement for a teacher in Twin Falls, it seemed like the right opportunity." Dalton sensed there was more to the story but did not press. Everyone had their reasons for ending up in places like Twin Falls, and not all of them were happy ones. After supper, the boarders dispersed to their various evening activities. Dalton stepped out onto the front porch, enjoying the cooler air that came with sunset. He was surprised when Katherine joined him a few minutes later, carrying a cup of tea. "I wanted to thank you for earlier," she said, standing at the porch rail beside him, "for not making me feel foolish about the dog." "Why would that make you foolish?" "Many people think it is silly to care so much about animals, especially strays. They say there are more important things to worry about." Katherine sipped her tea, her gaze fixed on the darkening street. "But I believe how we treat the helpless creatures in our care says a great deal about who we are." Dalton considered this. "My mother used to say something similar. She would always make sure the barn cats were fed, even during the hard winters when we barely had enough for ourselves. She said any creature that helped keep the mice from our grain stores earned its keep." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She was. She passed 5 years ago." The grief had dulled with time, but speaking of his mother still brought an ache to Dalton's chest. "I am sorry for your loss." Katherine's words carried genuine sympathy. "My own mother died when I was 15. My father followed 2 years later. I suppose that is part of why I came west. Everything back in Oregon felt haunted by their absence." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two people bound by shared loss and an understanding that needed no further words. The first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled its lonesome song. "I should check on the dog," Katherine said finally. "Thank you for the company, Mr. Crawford. Dalton, please just call me Dalton. Then you must call me Katherine." She smiled, and it transformed her entire face, making her eyes bright despite the fading light. "Good night, Dalton." "Good night, Katherine." He watched her go back inside, then remained on the porch for a while longer, smoking a cigarette and thinking about the strange turn his simple trip to Twin Falls had taken. He had come here to buy a horse. Instead, he had found himself captivated by a schoolteacher who rescued stray dogs and spoke about kindness as if it were the most important quality a person could possess. Perhaps it was. The next morning, Dalton woke before dawn, a habit ingrained by years of ranch work. He dressed quietly and made his way downstairs, intending to check on his horse at the livery before breakfast. But as he passed through the main hall, he heard sounds coming from the backyard. The splash of water and Katherine's voice speaking in those same soothing tones he had heard the day before. Curiosity drew him toward the back door. Through the window, he could see Katherine kneeling beside a metal washtub, gently bathing the stray dog. The animal stood docilely in the water, its tail wagging slowly as Katherine worked soap through its fur. In the early morning light, Dalton could see that beneath the dirt and matted hair, the dog had a coat of brown and white patches. It was a young dog, probably less than a year old, with intelligent eyes that watched Katherine with complete trust. Dalton stepped outside and Katherine looked up. "I hope I did not wake you. I wanted to get him cleaned up before the day grew too hot." "You did not wake me. I am always up early." Dalton came closer, studying the dog. Now that it was clean and properly fed, he could see it was actually a fine-looking animal, the sort that would make a good working dog on a ranch. "He looks much better already." "He does he not? I think someone must have cared for him once. He knows basic commands and he is very gentle." Katherine rinsed the soap from the dog's fur with a pitcher of clean water. "I just cannot understand how he ended up alone on the streets. Could be his owner died, or moved on and could not take him. Happens more often than you would think." Dalton knelt down and offered his hand for the dog to sniff. The animal's tail wagged more enthusiastically now, and it licked Dalton's fingers. "He has got a good temperament." "I was thinking the same thing. He would make an excellent companion for someone." Katherine lifted the dog out of the tub and wrapped it in an old blanket, rubbing it dry. "I just need to find the right person, someone who will appreciate him." "What will you do if you cannot find anyone in 3 days?" Katherine's jaw set with determination. "Then I will have to find somewhere else to live, somewhere that allows dogs. I will not put him back on the streets to starve." Dalton found himself saying, "My brother's ranch could use a good dog. We have been meaning to get one to help with the cattle and to keep Sarah company when we are out working the range." Katherine's face lit up with hope. "Truly? You think your brother would take him?" "I know he would. We lost our last dog to old age this past winter, and Sarah has been after us to find a replacement." Dalton continued to pet the dog, which had settled between them, content and calm. "Of course, I would need to make sure he is up to ranch work first. Maybe I could take him out for a few days, see how he handles himself around horses and cattle." "That seems reasonable." Katherine's relief was palpable. "But where would you keep him until then? Mrs. Patterson will not extend my time here. The livery has space." "Pete would not mind keeping him for a few days, especially if I pay for the privilege." Dalton made the offer without really thinking it through, acting on instinct and the desire to help Katherine, to ease the worry he saw in her eyes. "I could visit him there," Katherine said slowly, "to make sure he continues to recover and to work with him on his commands." "That would be fine." Pete usually has me helping out around the stable anyway when I am in town. We would likely see each other." Dalton met her eyes and saw understanding there, saw that she recognized he was creating reasons for them to spend more time together. They carried the dog to the livery after breakfast, Katherine walking beside Dalton through the quiet morning streets. Twin Falls was just beginning to wake up, shopkeepers opening their doors and ranch hands heading to their various jobs. A few people called greetings to Katherine, and Dalton noticed the respect with which they treated her, the affection in their voices. She had clearly made a place for herself in this community. Pete Thompson agreed readily to housing the dog, especially when Dalton explained the situation and pressed a few extra coins into his weathered hand. They settled the animal in a clean stall with fresh water and a bone to gnaw on, and Katherine spent several minutes giving the dog final instructions, as if it could understand her concerns about being left in a new place. "He will be fine," Dalton assured her. "Pete is good with animals. And I will be by later today to check on him." "I know, I am being ridiculous." Katherine straightened, brushing dog hair from her skirt. "It is just hard to let go once I have started caring for something." "That is not ridiculous. That is loyalty." Dalton walked with her back toward the boarding house. "The world needs more people who care as much as you do." Katherine glanced at him, something searching in her expression. "You are very kind, Dalton Crawford. I am glad you came to Twin Falls when you did." "So am I," Dalton replied, and meant it more than he expected. He had planned to leave that morning to take the roan mare and head back to his brother's ranch. But somehow those plans shifted, became more fluid. He told himself he needed to stay to work with the dog, to make sure the animal was suitable for ranch life. But in truth, he stayed because he wanted more time with Katherine, more opportunities to see her smile, to hear her talk about the things that mattered to her. Over the next 3 days, Dalton and Katherine fell into a pattern. Each morning, they met at the livery to work with the dog, who Katherine had started calling Scout. Dalton taught the animal basic herding commands, testing its instincts and intelligence. Scout proved to be quick to learn and eager to please, confirming Dalton's initial assessment that someone had trained him well before he became a stray. In the afternoons, Katherine taught her classes at the schoolhouse, and Dalton occupied himself with various tasks around town, helping Pete at the livery and running errands for Mrs. Patterson to earn his keep. But his thoughts constantly drifted to the schoolhouse at the edge of town, wondering what Katherine was teaching her students, imagining her at the front of the classroom with chalk dust on her fingers and that look of patient concentration he had come to recognize. On the evening of the 3rd day, Dalton worked up the courage to ask Katherine to dinner, not at the boarding house but at the small restaurant across from the general store. She accepted with a shy smile that made his heart beat faster. They sat at a corner table, and for the first time they talked not just about the dog or the weather or the mundane details of daily life, but about themselves, their hopes and fears and dreams. Katherine spoke of her love for teaching, the satisfaction she felt when a struggling student finally grasped a difficult concept. She talked about the books she loved, the poems she had memorized as a girl, the way she sometimes stood outside on clear nights just to marvel at the stars. Dalton told her about growing up on a small ranch in Wyoming, about learning to ride before he could properly walk. He spoke of the years he had spent on cattle drives, the loneliness of that life, and the raw beauty he had witnessed crossing the vast western territories. He talked about his brother, about the dream they shared of building something lasting, a ranch that could support their families for generations. "You want a family?" Katherine asked, her cheeks coloring slightly at the boldness of the question. "Children, I mean." "I do," Dalton replied honestly. Someday, when the ranch is more established and I have something solid to offer, I want what my parents had, a partnership built on respect and affection. I want children who grow up knowing they are loved and valued." He paused, then added, "What about you?" "I want the same thing. I always imagined having a family of my own, though after my parents died and I came west to teach, I began to think perhaps that dream was not meant for me." Katherine met his eyes across the table. "But lately, I have started to hope again." The air between them felt charged with possibility, with the recognition that something significant was taking shape. Dalton reached across the table and took Katherine's hand, and she did not pull away. Her fingers were slender and warm, ink stained from her teaching and marked with the scratches she had earned caring for Scout. "Katherine, I know we have only known each other a few days, but I feel as if I have been looking for you my whole life." The words came out more earnest than Dalton had intended, but he could not take them back, and he found he did not want to. "That first day when I saw you caring for that stray dog, putting his needs above your own comfort, above what others might think of you, that was when I knew you were special." Katherine's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I felt it too, from the moment you spoke to me, not judgment or mockery but understanding. You saw what I was doing and you approved, you supported it. Do you know how rare that is? Maybe we were meant to find each other. Maybe that dog appeared in Twin Falls just when he did because we both needed something to bring us together." Dalton knew how fanciful it sounded, but Katherine did not laugh at him. Instead, she squeezed his hand and said, "I would like to believe that. I would like to believe that sometimes life gives us exactly what we need, even when we did not know we were searching for it." They stayed at the restaurant until the owner began pointedly clearing his throat and stacking chairs on tables, a clear signal that he wanted to close for the night. Dalton walked Katherine back to the boarding house, and at the door, under the watchful eye of Mrs. Patterson visible through the front window, he kissed her hand and promised to see her in the morning. That night, Dalton lay awake in his small room, thinking about the future. He had come to Twin Falls on a simple errand and stumbled into something that felt like destiny. But there were practical matters to consider. His brother's ranch was 15 miles away, and Katherine's teaching position required her to remain in Twin Falls during the school year. He could not ask her to give up her work, especially knowing how much it meant to her. Yet the thought of leaving her, of returning to the ranch and seeing her only occasionally, felt wrong in a way he could not quite articulate. He was still wrestling with these thoughts the next morning when he met Katherine at the livery. Scout greeted them both with enthusiasm, his tail wagging so hard his entire body wriggled. The dog had filled out in the few days since Katherine had found him, his ribs no longer quite so prominent, his coat shining with health. "He looks wonderful," Katherine said, kneeling to embrace the dog. "You were right, Dalton. He is going to make a fine ranch dog. He is. My brother will be pleased." Dalton hesitated, then said, "I should probably head back to the ranch today. I have been gone longer than I intended and there is work that needs doing." Katherine's smile faltered. "Of course, you have responsibilities, I understand." "Come with me," Dalton said suddenly. "I know it is a lot to ask and you have your teaching, but it is Saturday. You could spend the day at the ranch, meet my brother and Sarah, see where Scout will be living. I could bring you back tomorrow in time for church." Katherine bit her lip, considering. "Mrs. Patterson would have opinions about me spending the night at your brother's ranch. Sarah would be there as chaperone. It would all be completely proper." Dalton felt desperate now, unwilling to leave without knowing when he would see Katherine again. "Please. I want you to see the ranch, to understand what my life is like there. And I think Sarah would enjoy your company. She does not get many visitors." After a long moment, Katherine nodded. "All right, but I need to pack a bag and leave word with Mrs. Patterson. And I should let Mr. Garrett know I will not be able to help with the church social planning meeting tomorrow afternoon. Take all the time you need. I will get the horses ready and settle my bill with Pete." An hour later, they were riding out of Twin Falls, Scout trotting happily alongside them. Katherine sat astride the roan mare Dalton had purchased for Sarah, and she handled the horse with easy competence that spoke of childhood riding experience. The morning was clear and bright, the air already warming toward what would be a hot afternoon. As they rode, Dalton pointed out landmarks: the creek where he sometimes fished, the stand of cottonwoods where cattle liked to gather in the heat of summer, the distant mountains that provided water for the valley through melting snow. Katherine listened attentively, asking questions that showed genuine interest in the land and the life it supported. "It is so different from Oregon," she said, shading her eyes to look at the rolling hills. "More open, more wild somehow, but beautiful in its own way." "It takes time to adjust to," Dalton agreed. "When I first came to Idaho, I missed the green of Wyoming, the mountains closer at hand. But the longer I stayed, the more I came to appreciate what this place offers. There is freedom here, room to build something without feeling crowded or hemmed in by other folks' expectations." They reached the Crawford Ranch just before noon. The property consisted of several hundred acres of rangeland, with a modest house, a barn, a bunkhouse for seasonal workers, and various outbuildings. Cattle grazed in the distance, and chickens scratched in the yard. Dalton's brother Daniel came out of the barn as they rode up, wiping his hands on a rag. Daniel Crawford was 2 years older than Dalton, with the same green-brown eyes but darker hair and a stockier build. He looked surprised to see his brother with a woman and a dog, but his expression quickly shifted to welcoming curiosity. "Dalton, I expected you back days ago. I was starting to think you had gotten into trouble." Daniel's gaze moved to Katherine, polite interest in his face. "No trouble, just unexpected delays." Dalton helped Katherine dismount. "Daniel, this is Miss Katherine Lambert. She is a school teacher in Twin Falls. Katherine, my brother Daniel. Pleased to meet you, Miss Lambert." Daniel shook her hand. "Welcome to our ranch." "Thank you for having me, Mr. Crawford. Dalton spoke very highly of the work you are doing here." Katherine glanced around the property with approving eyes. "It looks like a fine operation. We are getting there. Still a work in progress, but we are proud of what we have built so far." Daniel looked down at Scout, who was sniffing around the yard with interest. "And who is this?" "That is the other reason we are here," Dalton said. He explained about finding Katherine caring for the stray dog, about the work they had done training Scout over the past few days. "I thought he might be a good fit for the ranch, especially as a companion for Sarah." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Sarah Crawford appeared in the doorway of the house. She was a petite woman with auburn hair and a warm smile, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. "Did I hear my name? Oh, we have visitors." She hurried down the steps, her face brightening. "And a dog. Daniel, look, it is a dog. I see it, sweetheart." Daniel's voice was indulgent, his expression softening as he looked at his wife. Sarah immediately knelt beside Scout, who responded to her gentle approach with enthusiastic tail wagging and a lick to her cheek. "Oh, he is perfect. Where did you come from, sweet boy?" Katherine explained about finding Scout on the street in Twin Falls, about nursing him back to health and training him. As she talked, Dalton watched his sister-in-law fall completely in love with the dog, watched Scout respond to her with the same trust and affection he had shown Katherine. It was clear they were a good match. "Can we keep him?" Sarah looked up at Daniel with pleading eyes. "Please, he is exactly what we have been looking for. I do not see why not." Daniel ruffled the dog's ears. If Dalton says he is well trained and Katherine vouches for his temperament, that is good enough for me. Then it is settled. Sarah stood and embraced Katherine impulsively. Thank you so much for taking care of him and for bringing him here. You must stay for lunch and tell me all about yourself. Dalton mentioned in his last letter that Twin Falls had a new schoolteacher, but he did not say anything about becoming acquainted with her. Katherine laughed, returning the embrace. That is because the acquaintance is very new. We only met a few days ago. But sometimes a few days is all it takes to know something important. Sarah linked her arm through Katherine's and began leading her toward the house. Come inside. It is too hot to stand out in the yard, and I have fresh bread and cold chicken. We can talk while the men see to the horses. Dalton watched them go, feeling both pleased and nervous. He wanted Sarah to like Katherine, wanted his family to understand what he already knew, that this woman was someone special, someone worth making sacrifices for. She seems nice, Daniel said, leading the horses toward the barn. Pretty too. You planning to tell me what is really going on here? I am not entirely sure myself, Dalton admitted, unsaddling his horse. I went to Twin Falls to buy you a horse, and ended up meeting a woman who stopped everything to care for a stray dog. I watched her choose that animal's welfare over her own comfort, saw her stand up to folks who thought she was foolish, and I just knew. Knew she was different, knew I wanted to know more about her. And now you have brought her here. Daniel worked on the other horse, his movements practiced and efficient. Are you thinking serious thoughts about her already? Maybe, probably. Yes. Dalton hung up the saddle and turned to face his brother. I know it sounds crazy. We have only known each other a few days. But Daniel, I have never felt like this before. Every other woman I ever courted, it was nice enough, but there was always something missing. With Katherine, nothing is missing. Everything just fits. Daniel studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I felt that way about Sarah, knew within a week that I was going to marry her. Sometimes you just know, and there is no sense fighting it. He clapped Dalton on the shoulder. But take it slow, brother. Give her time to get used to the idea, to see if she feels the same way. Do not rush her into anything. I will not. I just want a chance to see where this could go. Then let us go inside and make sure Sarah is not interrogating your lady friend too thoroughly. You know how she gets when she is curious about something. They found Katherine and Sarah in the kitchen, already deep in conversation. Katherine had removed her hat and jacket, and she was helping Sarah set the table while they talked. The sight of it, the domestic ease of it, made something clench in Dalton's chest. He could imagine this scene repeated over and over. Katherine in his kitchen, in his life, in his future. Lunch was a pleasant affair, filled with good food and better conversation. Sarah peppered Katherine with questions about teaching, about her students, about life in Twin Falls. Katherine answered with patience and humor, and Dalton could see his sister-in-law warming to her, appreciating her intelligence and her genuine kindness. After the meal, Sarah insisted on showing Katherine around the property while Daniel and Dalton attended to some ranch business. They walked toward the corral where several horses grazed, Scout trailing behind them. Your brother and Sarah seem very happy together, Katherine observed, watching the easy way Daniel and Sarah interacted, the small touches and shared glances that spoke of deep affection. They are. It was hard at first, Sarah adjusting to ranch life after growing up in Boise. But they worked through the difficulties, and now I cannot imagine either of them without the other. Dalton hesitated, then added, that is what I want someday, a partnership like theirs built on love and respect. It is what I want too. Katherine turned to look at him, the afternoon sun catching golden highlights in her hair. Dalton, I need to be honest with you about something, about why I left Oregon. They found a shaded spot near the creek, sitting on a fallen log while Scout splashed in the shallow water. Katherine took a deep breath and began to speak. I was engaged to be married 3 years ago. His name was Robert, and he was the son of a successful merchant in Portland. Everyone thought we were a perfect match. But Robert wanted a wife who would be an ornament, someone to host his parties and bear his children and never express an opinion that might contradict his own. Katherine's voice was steady, but Dalton could hear the old hurt beneath her words. When I told him I wanted to continue teaching after we were married, he laughed at me. Said no wife of his would work, especially not at something as inappropriate as teaching. We argued about it constantly. What happened? Dalton asked gently. One day, about 2 months before our wedding, I found a stray cat. She had been hurt by a dog, her leg badly injured. I brought her to our house to care for her, and Robert was furious. He said the animal was dirty and diseased, that I was making a fool of myself over a worthless creature. He grabbed the cat and threw her outside, and I heard her crying in pain. Katherine's hands clenched into fists at the memory. I broke off our engagement that day. Robert tried to convince everyone that I was unbalanced, that I had lost my mind over a cat. His family had influence in Portland, and suddenly I found it difficult to find teaching work. That is when I saw the advertisement for a position in Twin Falls. I am sorry you went through that, Dalton said, but I am glad you had the strength to walk away. You deserve better than a man who would treat you or any living creature that way. Do you really think so? Most people thought I was foolish to give up a good match over something so trivial. It was not trivial. It showed you who he really was, what kind of man he would be as a husband. You were right to leave him. Dalton took her hand. Katherine, the things that drew me to you, your kindness and compassion, your willingness to care for creatures that cannot care for themselves, those are not flaws. They are strengths. Any man who cannot see that is a fool. Katherine's eyes filled with tears. Thank you for saying that. You cannot know how much it means to hear someone validate my choices instead of criticizing them. I am not just saying it. I mean it with everything in me. Dalton cupped her face gently with his free hand. That moment when I saw you caring for Scout, that was when I knew you were special. Not in spite of your kindness, but because of it. You have a good heart, Katherine Lambert, and I would count myself the luckiest man alive if you would let me be part of your life. You already are part of my life, Katherine whispered. These past few days, getting to know you, working with Scout together, I have been happier than I have been in years. You make me feel seen, valued, appreciated for who I actually am instead of who someone else wants me to be. Dalton leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to. But Katherine closed the distance between them, and their lips met in a kiss that felt both gentle and momentous, a promise of things to come. When they finally pulled apart, both were slightly breathless. I should court you properly, Dalton said, his forehead resting against hers. Take my time, do things right. You should, Katherine agreed, but she was smiling. But I think we can both acknowledge that this is more than a casual acquaintance. Much more. Dalton kissed her again, longer this time, and Katherine's arms came up around his neck, pulling him closer. They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the ranch property together, talking about everything and nothing, learning each other's stories. Katherine told him about her students, the challenges and joys of teaching children who came from such different backgrounds and circumstances. Dalton spoke about his dreams for expanding the ranch, about breeding better cattle and improving the range eland. As evening approached, Sarah insisted Katherine stay for supper. Over fried chicken and mashed potatoes, they made plans for the future. Katherine would return to Twin Falls the next day, but Dalton would visit every weekend, making the 15-mile ride to see her. Sarah invited Katherine to visit the ranch anytime she wanted. extending an open welcome that made Catherine's eyes shine with gratitude. That night, Katherine slept in the guest room Sarah had prepared, and Dalton bunked with his brother like they had as boys. But before retiring, Dalton and Katherine stood together on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Thank you for bringing me here," Katherine said softly, "for letting me see this part of your life, for introducing me to your family. Thank you for coming, for taking a chance on me." Dalton held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, memorizing the feel of her in his arms. "Katherine, I know it is early to say this, but I think I am falling in love with you." Katherine pulled back just enough to look at his face, her expression serious in the starlight. "I think I am falling in love with you too, Dalton Crawford, and it terrifies me and thrills me in equal measure." "We will figure it out together," Dalton promised. "Whatever challenges come, whatever obstacles we face, we will handle them together." "Together," Katherine echoed, and the word felt like a vow. The next morning, Dalton kept his promise and brought Katherine back to Twin Falls in time for church. They rode slowly, reluctant to end their time together, talking about the week ahead and when they might see each other again. At the edge of town, Dalton helped Katherine down from the roan mare. "I will be back next Saturday," he told her. "Maybe we could have supper together and you could show me around the schoolhouse." "I would like that very much." Katherine straightened his collar, a tender gesture that spoke of growing intimacy. "Be safe riding back to the ranch." "I will. You be safe too." Dalton kissed her forehead, aware that they were within sight of the town and needed to maintain propriety. "Think of me this week." "I will think of little else," Katherine admitted with a rueful smile. Dalton waited until she had disappeared into the boarding house before mounting his horse and turning back toward the ranch. His heart felt both full and hollow, pleased with the time they had spent together, but already missing her presence. The 15 miles back to the ranch seemed longer than usual, and his thoughts kept drifting to Katherine. The sound of her laugh, the way she bit her lip when she was thinking, the softness of her mouth against his. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm. Every Saturday, Dalton made the ride to Twin Falls, and he and Katherine spent their precious time together exploring their growing feelings for each other. He attended church with her on Sundays, enduring the speculative looks from the other townspeople who had clearly noticed their courtship. Katherine visited the ranch every few weeks, and Sarah grew to love her like a sister, the two women often disappearing into conversation while Dalton and Daniel saw to the never-ending work of running a cattle ranch. Scout thrived in his new home, proving to be exactly the companion Sarah needed and an able helper with the cattle. Every time Dalton saw the dog, happy and healthy, racing across the rangeland or sleeping contentedly on the porch, he thought of Katherine and the kindness that had saved the animal's life. That kindness had changed Dalton's life too, had brought him something he had not even known he was searching for. In October, when the heat of summer had given way to the crisp coolness of autumn, Dalton asked Katherine to marry him. He did it simply, without elaborate planning or fancy speeches. They were walking along the creek in Twin Falls, the cottonwood trees golden with fall color, and the words just came. "Katherine, I love you. I want to spend my life with you, build a future together. Will you marry me?" Katherine stopped walking, her eyes wide. "Yes," she said, and then louder, "Yes, Dalton, I will marry you." He kissed her there on the creek bank, with the autumn wind rustling through the golden leaves and the water singing over the rocks. When they finally pulled apart, Katherine was laughing and crying at the same time, and Dalton felt as if his heart might burst from happiness. "I do not have a ring yet," he admitted. "I wanted to ask you first, make sure you would say yes before I spent money we might need for other things." "I do not need a ring to know you love me," Katherine said, "but I will wear one proudly when you can afford it." They married in December, in the small church in Twin Falls with most of the town in attendance. Sarah stood up with Katherine, and Daniel served as Dalton's best man. Katherine wore a simple dress of dove-gray silk that Sarah had helped her sew, and she carried a bouquet of evergreen branches tied with white ribbon, winter flowers being impossible to find. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, the minister speaking about love and commitment, about the sacred bond between husband and wife. When Dalton slipped the simple gold band onto Katherine's finger, purchased with money he had saved over months of careful budgeting, her eyes shone with tears. And when they kissed as husband and wife, sealing their vows before God and their community, Dalton knew he had found what he had been searching for all his life. Katherine gave notice at the school, and though the town was sorry to lose their teacher, everyone understood and wished her well. They held a farewell party at the schoolhouse, and several of her students cried, making Katherine promise to visit whenever she came to town. She moved to the ranch in January of 1884, and though the adjustment was not always easy, Katherine approached ranch life with the same determination and kindness she brought to everything else. She learned to cook for ranch hands, to preserve food for the winter, to tend the vegetable garden that Sarah helped her plant. She learned to read the weather and the cattle, to understand the rhythms of ranch life. But she also maintained her own identity, her own passions. She started teaching basic reading and arithmetic to the few children of neighboring ranchers, holding informal classes in the ranch house kitchen. She continued to care for injured or abandoned animals, and the ranch accumulated a collection of creatures she had rescued. A one-eyed cat, a lame chicken that Sarah insisted could not be eaten, a young deer with a twisted leg that Katherine nursed back to health before releasing it back into the wild. Dalton never complained about the extra work these animals created. Instead, he helped her care for them, understanding that Katherine's compassion was an intrinsic part of who she was, and he had fallen in love with the whole of her, not just the parts that were convenient. In the spring of 1885, Katherine discovered she was pregnant. The news brought joy tinged with anxiety, as the nearest doctor was in Boise, hours away by wagon. But Sarah, who had grown up helping her mother attend births, promised to help when the time came, and the knowledge eased Katherine's fears. Their son was born in October, a healthy baby boy with Katherine's green eyes and Dalton's dark hair. They named him James, after Dalton's father, and Dalton held his son for the first time with tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed by the love he felt for this tiny person. Katherine proved to be a devoted mother, but she did not lose herself in motherhood the way some women did. She continued teaching the neighbor children when she could, continued rescuing animals, continued being the woman Dalton had fallen in love with. And Dalton supported her in all of it, caring for James when Katherine needed time for herself, understanding that she was happiest when she could balance all the different parts of her life. 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter they named Rose, after Katherine's mother. And 3 years after that, another son they called Benjamin. The ranch house that had once seemed too large for just Dalton and Daniel now rang with the sounds of children laughing and playing, of family meals around the big kitchen table, of life being fully lived. Scout grew old and gray, but he remained devoted to the family, especially to the children, who treated him with the gentleness Katherine had instilled in them from birth. Katherine taught her children the same lessons her own mother had taught her, that all creatures deserved kindness, that strength came from compassion, that how you treated the helpless said everything about your character. Daniel and Sarah had children of their own, 3 daughters who grew up alongside their cousins, the ranch becoming a place where family gathered and love flourished. The two families worked the ranch together, expanding it gradually over the years, building something lasting and good. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Dalton gave Katherine a gift he had been planning for months. It was a small cabin he had built near the creek, a place where she could go to read and think, and have time to herself when the demands of ranch life and motherhood became overwhelming. He had furnished it simply but comfortably, with a desk and bookshelves, a comfortable chair, and windows that looked out over the water. Katherine cried when she saw it, understanding the love and thought that had gone into the gesture. "You built this for me." "I did. I know you need space sometimes, room to breathe and be just Katherine, not mother or wife or teacher. This is your place, somewhere you can come whenever you need to." Dalton wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "I love you, Katherine. I love all of you, including the parts that need solitude and quiet." "How did I get so lucky?" Katherine turned in his arms, her eyes searching his face. "How did I find a man who understands me so completely?" "I think a scrawny stray dog had something to do with it," Dalton said with a smile. "And your inability to walk past a creature in need." Katherine laughed, the sound as bright and joyful as it had been on the day they met. "Then I suppose I should be grateful for my own soft heart, even though people always told me it would lead to trouble. It led you to me." "I would not call that trouble." "No," Katherine agreed, kissing him softly. "I would call that the best decision I ever made." They stood together in the doorway of the cabin, watching the creek flow past, the same creek where Dalton had first told Katherine he was falling in love with her all those years ago. The water kept flowing, seasons changed, children grew, but their love remained constant, a foundation upon which they had built a life of meaning and purpose. The years continued to pass, marked by both joys and sorrows. They lost Daniel to a riding accident when James was 15, a tragedy that devastated the family but also brought them closer together. Dalton took over full management of the ranch, and Katherine helped Sarah through her grief, the two women supporting each other as they had always done. James grew into a fine young man, responsible and hardworking, with his mother's compassion and his father's steady nature. He took over much of the day-to-day ranch work, allowing Dalton to slow down a bit as his body began to feel the accumulated wear of decades of hard physical labor. Rose inherited her mother's love of teaching and eventually opened a proper school for the children of the valley, building on the informal education Katherine had been providing for years. Benjamin chose a different path, studying law in Boise and eventually becoming a judge, using his position to advocate for fair treatment of all people, regardless of their circumstances. Katherine continued her rescue work throughout her life, though she moved more slowly as the years took their toll. The ranch remained a haven for injured and abandoned animals, and travelers passing through the valley learned that the Crawford Ranch was a place where kindness could be found. Scout lived to the remarkable age of 17, finally passing peacefully in his sleep on the porch he had claimed as his own territory. They buried him under the big cottonwood tree near the house, and the whole family gathered to say goodbye to the dog that had brought Dalton and Katherine together. Katherine cried openly, and Dalton held her, understanding that she was mourning not just the dog but also the younger versions of themselves, the people they had been when they first met in Twin Falls all those years ago. "You remember that day?" Katherine asked him that night as they lay in bed, the moon casting silver light through their window. "The day you first spoke to me." "Every detail," Dalton replied. "You were kneeling in the dust, caring for a stray dog while other people walked past without a second glance. I watched you choose that animal's welfare over your own comfort, and I knew immediately that you were different, that you were special. You told me that later. You said that is when I knew you were special. I think that was the moment I started falling in love with you, when I realized you saw my kindness as a strength rather than a weakness. Katherine nestled closer to him. Robert would have been ashamed of me for stopping to help that dog, but you understood. You have always understood. Because kindness is a strength, Katherine. It is what has made our life together so rich, so full of meaning. Your compassion has shaped our children, influenced everyone who has known you. The world is better because you are in it. We built something good together, did we not? Katherine's voice was soft, reflective. A life worth living, a family worth having, a love worth fighting for. We did, and I would not change a single moment of it, even the hard times. Every joy and every sorrow brought us to right here, right now, and I cannot imagine being anywhere else. Dalton kissed her forehead, a gesture of tenderness worn smooth by decades of repetition. I love you, Katherine Crawford. I have loved you from the moment I saw you caring for that stray dog, and I will love you until my last breath. And I love you, Dalton Crawford. Thank you for seeing me, for valuing me, for building this beautiful life with me. They fell asleep that way, wrapped in each other's arms, content in the knowledge that they had found what so many people spent their entire lives searching for, a love that was true and deep and lasting. On a bright morning in late spring, when Katherine was 63 years old and Dalton 65, they saddled horses and rode out to the place where they had first kissed, by the creek with the golden cottonwoods. Their grandchildren had offered to pack them a lunch, and they spent the afternoon as they had spent so many afternoons over the years, talking and laughing and simply being together. You have any regrets? Dalton asked as they sat on the same fallen log where they had once sat as young people just beginning to fall in love. Katherine considered the question seriously, as she considered all questions. I regret that I did not meet you sooner, that we lost years we could have spent together. But then, I think perhaps we needed those years apart to become the people we needed to be for each other. I needed to leave Oregon and learn to stand on my own. You needed time to establish the ranch, to be ready for a family. That is wise, Dalton said. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had not come to Twin Falls that particular day, if I had sent one of the ranch hands to buy that horse instead of going myself. I think we would have found each other anyway, Katherine said with confidence. Maybe not that day, but eventually. Some things are meant to be, and we were meant to be. As they rode back to the ranch that evening, the sun setting in glorious shades of orange and pink, Dalton felt a profound sense of gratitude for the life he had been given. He had his health, his family, his land, and most importantly, he had Katherine. Everything else was just details. The ranch continued to thrive under James's management, and eventually his children began taking on more responsibility, the fourth generation of Crawfords to work the land. Rose's school had expanded to include secondary education, and young people from across the valley attended her classes. Benjamin had made a name for himself as a fair and compassionate judge, known for his willingness to listen to all sides of a dispute before rendering judgment. Katherine and Dalton moved into a smaller house on the property, leaving the main house to James and his growing family. It was a cozy place with a large front porch, and Katherine filled it with her books and the small treasures she had collected over a lifetime. Dalton built her raised garden beds so she could continue tending her vegetables without having to bend so far, and he constructed bird feeders that she kept filled year-round. They fell into the comfortable rhythms of later life. no longer burdened by the intense physical labor of their younger years, but still engaged with the ranch and the family. Dalton offered advice when James asked for it, but otherwise stayed out of the way, trusting his son to make his own decisions and learn from his own mistakes. Katherine volunteered at Rose's school occasionally, helping students who struggled with reading, and she continued to provide a safe haven for injured animals, though she now had grandchildren to help with the actual work of caring for them. On quiet evenings, they sat together on their porch, watching the sun set over the land they had worked and loved for so many years. Sometimes they talked, sharing memories or discussing the events of the day. Sometimes they simply sat in companionable silence, comfortable enough with each other that words were unnecessary. "I wonder what happened to Mrs. Patterson," Katherine mused one evening. "I should have written to her more often, let her know how grateful I was for her kindness in allowing me to keep scout those few days." She knew, Dalton assured her. Some kindnesses do not require acknowledgement. She saw what was happening between us, even before we fully understood it ourselves. I think she was happy to play a small part in our story. "Our story," Katherine repeated, smiling. "I like thinking of our life that way, as a story with a beginning, middle, and eventually an end. But what a beautiful story it has been." "It is not over yet," Dalton pointed out. "We still have more chapters to write." "True. Though I hope they are peaceful chapters without too much excitement. I have had enough excitement for one lifetime." Dalton laughed. "Says the woman who brought home a baby skunk just last month because it looked hungry. It was hungry, and I was very careful about the scent glands. You were indeed, I will give you that." They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary surrounded by family and friends. Dozens of people gathering at the ranch to honor the couple who had become pillars of their community. Katherine wore a new dress for the occasion, deep green that brought out her eyes, and Dalton wore his best suit, feeling stiff and formal but willing to endure it for Katherine's sake. Their children and grandchildren had prepared speeches, sharing stories about their parents and grandparents, talking about the lessons they had learned from Katherine and Dalton's example. Rose spoke eloquently about her mother's kindness and her father's steadfast support, about the way they had built a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection. James talked about the work ethic his father had instilled in him, but also about the importance of compassion, something he had learned from his mother. Benjamin shared stories from his childhood, about how his parents had always encouraged him to think for himself, to question authority when necessary, to stand up for what was right even when it was difficult. When it was Katherine's turn to speak, she stood slowly, accepting Dalton's hand to help her rise. She looked out at the gathered crowd, at the faces of her children and grandchildren, her extended family and friends, and her eyes shone with tears. "I came to Idaho 40 years ago looking for a fresh start," she began, her voice still strong despite her years. "I had experienced heartbreak and disappointment, and I was not sure I would ever find the kind of love I had always dreamed of. But then I found a stray dog lying in the street and I stopped to help him, and a cowboy noticed. He noticed my kindness, and instead of thinking I was foolish, he saw it as something valuable, something special. That moment changed my life." She turned to look at Dalton, and he rose to stand beside her, his arm around her waist. "Dalton has spent the past 40 years making me feel valued and appreciated, supporting my passions even when they were inconvenient, loving me not in spite of who I am but because of who I am. He has given me a life beyond my wildest dreams, filled with love and purpose and meaning. I could not ask for more." Dalton cleared his throat, fighting back his own tears. "Katherine likes to say I noticed her kindness, but the truth is, Her kindness was impossible to miss. She has spent her entire life caring for those who cannot care for themselves, whether they are stray animals or struggling students or neighbors in need. She has made me a better man, made our children better people, made this entire community better through her example. I am the lucky one in this partnership, and I thank God every day for bringing us together." They kissed then, to the cheers and applause of their gathered loved ones, and Dalton thought about how far they had come from that first meeting in Twin Falls. They had built a life together, raised children who were making their own positive impacts on the world, created a legacy of love and kindness that would continue long after they were gone. The years continued their inevitable march. Katherine developed arthritis that made it difficult to work in her garden, so Dalton did the planting and weeding while she supervised from a chair, directing him with the same patient authority she had once used with her students. His eyesight began to fail, so Katherine read to him in the evenings, her voice bringing to life the stories and poems they both loved. They took care of each other through the various indignities of aging, maintaining their dignity and their love through it all. When Katherine fell and broke her hip, Dalton nursed her back to health with the same gentle care she had once shown to Scout. When Dalton came down with pneumonia, Katherine sat by his bedside day and night until the fever broke and he was out of danger. "We are getting old," Katherine observed one morning as they sat on their porch, wrapped in blankets against the autumn chill. "We are," Dalton agreed. "But we are getting old together, which is all I ever wanted." "Me too. Though I confess I miss being able to move without every joint protesting. I miss being able to see clearly without squinting, but I can still see you, and that is all that matters." Katherine smiled and took his hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of 4 decades of practice. "Do you remember what you told me that first night at the ranch? You said you wanted a partnership built on respect and affection. I think we achieved that, do you not? We did more than achieve it. We perfected it." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching their great-grandchildren play in the yard, Scout's descendants chasing them with joyful barks. The ranch had grown and prospered beyond what either of them had imagined possible, and their family had expanded to include dozens of people, all of them carrying forward the values Katherine and Dalton had worked so hard to instill. On a cold morning in February, when Katherine was 71 and Dalton 73, they woke early as they always had. Katherine made coffee while Dalton built up the fire, their morning routine unchanged despite their years. They sat together at their small kitchen table, watching the sun rise over the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gold. "It is beautiful," Katherine said softly. "After all these years, I still find the sunrise beautiful." "Some things never lose their wonder," Dalton replied, but he was looking at her, not the sunrise. Katherine caught his gaze and laughed. "You old romantic. After 46 years, you still look at me that way, always. You are still the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." They finished their coffee and dressed warmly, deciding to take a short walk despite the cold. They made their way slowly to the creek, to the place that had become sacred to them over the decades. The cottonwoods stood bare and stark against the winter sky, but they were no less beautiful for their bareness. "You remember the first time we came here together?" Dalton asked, helping Katherine over a rough patch of ground. "You told me about your broken engagement, about why you left Oregon." "I remember. I was so nervous, worried you would think less of me for breaking off my engagement over a cat. But you understood. You always understood." Katherine leaned against him, seeking his warmth. "That was when I knew for certain that I loved you, when I realized I could tell you the truth about myself, and you would not judge me for it. I have never judged you. I have only ever admired you, loved you, tried to be worthy of you. You have always been worthy of me, Dalton. More than worthy." They stood by the frozen creek, two people who had shared a lifetime together, who had weathered every storm and celebrated every joy side by side. The love that had begun with a simple act of kindness had grown and deepened over the years, becoming something solid and enduring, a foundation strong enough to support not just their own lives but the lives of their children and grandchildren as well. No regrets. Dalton asked, as he had asked so many times over the years. "None," Katherine replied firmly. "Not a single one." They returned to the house as the sun climbed higher, warming the day. Katherine made breakfast while Dalton read the newspaper, and they talked about the visit James had planned for later in the week, about the new foal that had been born in the barn, about all the small details that made up their daily life. Later that afternoon, as Katherine napped in her favorite chair and Dalton read beside her, he thought about the journey that had brought them here. He thought about that scrawny stray dog, about Katherine's compassion, about the courage it had taken for him to follow her, to insert himself into her life, to take a chance on something that had felt significant from the very beginning. Scout had been dead for years now, but his legacy lived on in the family that existed because Katherine had stopped to help him. It was a legacy of kindness, of choosing compassion over convenience, of recognizing that how we treat the most vulnerable among us reveals our true character. Katherine stirred in her chair, opening her eyes to find Dalton watching her. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, her voice still heavy with sleep. "I was thinking about Scout, about how a stray dog changed both our lives. If you had walked past him that day, if you had listened to Mrs. Henderson and left him lying there, we might never have met. Our children would not exist. This whole life we have built together would not exist." "But I did not walk past him," Katherine said. "I could not walk past him. It is not in my nature to ignore suffering when I have the power to alleviate it. And you saw that quality in me and valued it. That is why we worked, Dalton. You never asked me to be anyone other than who I am." "Because who you are is exactly who I needed," Dalton replied. "Who I still need." The years had been kind to them, allowing them to grow old together, to see their legacy take root and flourish. They had faced challenges, certainly. Droughts and harsh winters, financial difficulties and personal losses, the normal trials that come with a long life. But they had faced those challenges together, supporting each other, never losing sight of the love that had brought them together in the first place. As spring arrived, and then summer, Katherine began to slow down more noticeably. She tired easily and spent more time resting, though she insisted she was fine, just feeling her age. Dalton worried but did not hover, understanding that Katherine needed her independence, her sense of being capable and useful. On a warm evening in July, they sat on their porch as the sun set, surrounded by family. James and his wife had brought supper, and Rose had come with her husband and children. Benjamin had ridden out from Boys, bringing his family for a weekend visit. The porch and yard were filled with noise and laughter, with children playing and adults talking, with the rich chaos of a large, loving family. Katherine surveyed the scene with satisfaction. "We did well," she said to Dalton, her voice just loud enough for him to hear over the general noise. "Look at them all. Look at what we created." "We did," Dalton agreed, his heart full. "We did very well indeed." As the evening darkened and the children were called inside, Dalton and Katherine remained on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one. They sat close together, Katherine's head on Dalton's shoulder, his arm around her waist. "I have been thinking," Katherine said quietly, "about what comes next after all this is over. After what is over, after our story ends, after one of us is no longer here." Catherine's voice was calm, matter-of-fact. "We are old, Dalton. We will not live forever. I know." Dalton tightened his arm around her, "But I try not to think about it. We should think about it just enough to be prepared. I want you to know that I have had a wonderful life, that I have no regrets, that every day with you has been a gift. If I go first, I do not want you to grieve too long. Our life together was too joyful to be marred by excessive sadness. If you go first, I will grieve for as long as I need to," Dalton said firmly. "But I will also celebrate what we had, the love we shared, and I will try to live the rest of my days in a way that honors your memory. That is all I ask." Katherine lifted her head to kiss him gently. "Though I hope we have many more years together yet." "As do I. As do I." They lived 5 more years, 5 precious years filled with simple pleasures and deep contentment. They celebrated birthdays and anniversaries, holidays and family gatherings. They watched their great-grandchildren grow, saw new generations carry forward the traditions and values they had worked so hard to establish. Katherine passed away peacefully in her sleep on a quiet morning in October, the same month she had first found Scout all those years ago. She simply did not wake up, her heart finally giving out after 76 years of faithful service. Dalton woke to find her still and cold beside him, and though he had known this day would come, the reality of it hit him like a physical blow. He sat with her for a long time before calling for help, holding her hand and speaking to her as if she could still hear him, thanking her for their life together, for her love, for everything she had given him. When James finally came and found them, father and son wept together, mourning the woman who had been the heart of their family. They buried Katherine on the hill overlooking the ranch, in a spot she had chosen years earlier. The funeral was large, attended by seemingly everyone who had ever known her. Former students spoke about the impact she had had on their lives. Neighbors shared stories of her kindness, of the times she had helped them through difficult situations. Rose read from Katherine's favorite poems, her voice breaking with emotion. Dalton spoke last, standing at his wife's grave with his children beside him. "Katherine Lambert Crawford was the finest person I ever knew," he said simply. "She taught me that kindness is strength, that compassion is courage, that love is the most important thing we can give to each other. She lived her values every single day, caring for those who could not care for themselves, standing up for what was right even when it was difficult. I was blessed beyond measure to share my life with her, and I will carry her love with me until we meet again." They lowered her casket into the ground, and Dalton placed a single flower on top before they covered it with earth. He stood there long after everyone else had left, talking to her, telling her about the beautiful day it had been, about how the sunset had painted the sky in her favorite colors. In the days and weeks that followed, Dalton struggled with the emptiness Katherine's absence had left. The house felt too quiet without her presence, too cold without her warmth. He went through the motions of daily life, but his heart was not in it. His children worried, visiting frequently, trying to draw him back into engagement with life. It was James who finally broke through to him, sitting on the porch with his father on a crisp autumn evening. "Mother would not want you to give up," he said gently. "She would want you to keep living, to keep finding joy in the world." "I know," Dalton replied. "I know you are right. It is just hard. Everything reminds me of her. Every room in this house, every path on this ranch, every sunrise and sunset. She is everywhere and nowhere, and I do not know how to exist without her." "You exist by remembering her love, by continuing the work she started, by being the man she fell in love with." James put his hand on his father's shoulder. "You taught me that love does not end with death, that the people we love continue to shape us even after they are gone." Mother is still with you, Father. She always will be. Dalton thought about this, about the truth in his son's words. Katherine had always said that kindness had power, that love changed the world. She had proven it through her life, through the way she had touched so many people, through the family they had raised together. He began to emerge from his grief slowly, not forgetting Katherine but learning to carry the memory of her with grace, rather than letting it weigh him down. He spent time with his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandmother, making sure they understood the legacy she had left them. He volunteered at Rose's school, working with struggling readers the way Katherine had done. He continued to care for injured animals, honoring Katherine's compassion in the most direct way he knew how. On what would have been their 52nd wedding anniversary, Dalton rode out to the creek, to the place where he had first kissed Katherine all those years ago. He sat on the fallen log, now rotting and covered with moss, and he talked to her as if she were sitting beside him. "I miss you every day," he said to the wind, to the water, to the sky. "But I am grateful for the years we had, for the life we built together. You made me better, Katherine. You made everything better. And I promise to honor your memory by living the rest of my days with the same kindness and compassion you showed to the world." He sat there for a long time, remembering. He remembered the first day he saw her, kneeling in the dust to care for a stray dog. He remembered the way she had looked at him across the dinner table at the boarding house, the way she had kissed him by this very creek. He remembered their wedding day, the births of their children, the countless ordinary moments that had made up their extraordinary life together. As the sun began to set, Dalton stood and made his way back to the ranch. The walk was harder than it used to be, his body protesting the exertion, but he made it. James was waiting at the house, having brought supper, and they ate together and talked about the ranch, about the family, about all the things that continued despite loss and grief. Dalton lived 3 more years after Katherine's death, 3 years in which he made peace with his grief and found joy again in the simple pleasures of life. He watched his great-grandchildren grow, taught them to ride and to care for animals, passed on the lessons Katherine had taught him about kindness and compassion. He died quietly in his sleep on a spring morning, his children and grandchildren gathered around his bed. His last words were of Katherine, saying her name like a prayer, reaching for her hand as if she were there waiting for him. They buried him beside Katherine on the hill, and the same crowd that had gathered for her funeral returned to honor him. Rose stood at the grave and read the same poems her mother had loved, her voice strong despite her tears. James spoke about his father's integrity, his work ethic, his unwavering love for his family. Benjamin talked about the lessons his father had taught him, about standing up for what is right, about treating all people with dignity and respect. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren placed flowers on the grave, and someone had brought one of Scout's descendants, a dog that looked remarkably like the stray that had brought Dalton and Katherine together all those years ago. The dog sat quietly by the grave, as if paying its own respects to the people who had begun a legacy of kindness to animals. Years passed, and the ranch continued under the stewardship of the Crawford descendants. The story of how Dalton and Katherine met became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. The tale of the stray dog and the schoolteacher, of the cowboy who had noticed her kindness and recognized it as something special, became a touchstone for the family, a reminder of the values that had founded their legacy. Rose included the story in her curriculum, using it to teach her students about compassion and courage, about seeing the value in people who choose kindness over convenience. James taught it to the young ranch hands, explaining that how you treat animals reveals your character, that cruelty in any form will not be tolerated on Crawford land. Benjamin told the story in his courtroom when appropriate, using it to illustrate the importance of mercy and understanding. The family remained close, gathering regularly at the ranch for holidays and celebrations, maintaining the traditions Katherine and Dalton had established. They continued Katherine's practice of caring for injured and abandoned animals, and the ranch became known as a place where kindness could be found, where those in need would be helped without judgment. The small cabin Dalton had built for Katherine became a place of pilgrimage for family members seeking solitude or needing to reconnect with their roots. Katherine's books still lined the shelves, and her notebooks filled with observations about nature, and her students were carefully preserved. Young people of each generation would spend time there, reading her words, understanding where they had come from and the values they were expected to uphold. The twin graves on the hill became a place of peace and reflection. Grandchildren brought their sweethearts there to tell them the story of Katherine and Dalton, to explain the kind of love they hoped to find for themselves. Great-grandchildren played nearby, watched over by the ghosts of two people who had loved deeply and lived well. In time, those who had known Katherine and Dalton personally passed on as well, but the story remained, kept alive through careful retelling and through the values embedded in every generation. The Crawford family prospered, not just financially but morally, spiritually, producing generation after generation of people who chose kindness, who stood up for the vulnerable, who understood that how we treat the least among us defines who we are. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when the mist rose from the creek and the light was soft and golden, family members working the ranch would swear they saw two figures walking hand in hand by the water, an old cowboy and the woman he loved, still together even in death, their love as enduring as the land itself. The legacy of a stray dog, a kind-hearted schoolteacher, and a cowboy who noticed her compassion lived on, proving that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the most profound and lasting change. Katherine had been right all those years ago when she said that how we treat the helpless reveals our character. She and Dalton had treated all creatures with dignity and respect, and in doing so, they had built something beautiful and lasting. Their story became more than just family history. It became a parable, a teaching tool, a reminder that love can be found in unexpected places, that kindness is never wasted, that the values we choose to live by matter more than wealth or status or power. And though the world changed around them, though technology advanced and society evolved, the fundamental truth of their story remained constant. That love, built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine compassion, endures forever. Twin Falls continued to grow and prosper over the decades, evolving from a small frontier town into a thriving community. But those who knew the town's history remembered Katherine Lambert, the schoolteacher who had given so much to her students and to the community. A plaque was placed at the site where the old schoolhouse had stood, commemorating her years of service and her impact on the lives of countless children. The boarding house where Katherine and Dalton had first stayed became a historical landmark, preserved as an example of frontier life in the 1880s. Tour guides told the story of the schoolteacher and the cowboy, of the stray dog that had brought them together, of the love that had flourished in that simple establishment. And so the story lived on, passed down through generations, adapted and retold but never forgotten. It lived on in the kindness the Crawford family showed to animals and to each other. It lived on in the teachers who chose compassion over harsh discipline, in the ranchers who treated their livestock with respect, in the ordinary people who stopped to help those in need. Katherine and Dalton Crawford had built a legacy that extended far beyond their own lives, far beyond their own family. They had proven that one act of kindness, one moment of compassion, one choice to care for a helpless creature, could change everything. They had shown that true love is built not on grand gestures but on daily choice, on consistent support, on seeing and valuing the best in each other. Their story was complete, their lives fully lived, their love eternally preserved in the memories of those they had touched and in the values they had instilled in their descendants. And if love could be measured not in years but in impact, then theirs was among the greatest love stories ever told, a testament to the power of kindness and the enduring strength of a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection. The sun continued to rise and set over the Crawford Ranch, over the hill where Katherine and Dalton rested side by side, over the creek where they had fallen in love, over the land they had worked and cherished. Seasons changed, years passed, but their love remained, as constant as the stars, as enduring as the mountains, as eternal as the love between two souls who had found in each other everything they had ever needed, and more than they had ever dared to dream.